I didn't flinch when my colleague Marcus said it. I didn't drop my coffee cup or grab the edge of my desk. I just sat very still and let the words land somewhere inside my chest where they stayed, cold and heavy, for a long time afterward. Your grandfather's lawyer called the office looking for you, Marcus said, setting a sticky note on my keyboard. Said it was urgent. Said he'd been trying to reach you for weeks. I looked at the name on the note. Gerald Fitzpatrick, barrister and solicitor, Ottawa. I didn't know any Gerald Fitzpatrick. And my grandfather had been dead for 14 months. My name is Claire Beaumont Okafor. I'm 31 years old, and at the time of that phone call, I was working as a registered nurse at a mid-sized hospital in Sudbury, Ontario, doing double shifts whenever they'd let me, eating granola bars for dinner 3 nights out of 5, and sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with my 8-year-old son, Noah, and a landlord who liked to remind me on the first of every month that he could find another tenant tomorrow if I wasn't happy with the place. I wasn't unhappy. I was just tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. Noah's father had left when Noah was 2, which I had eventually made peace with. What I hadn't made peace with was how I'd ended up here in this apartment, in this particular version of my life when my grandfather had promised me, on more than one occasion, that he would make sure I was taken care of. That was the word he used, taken care of. He had a small but profitable plumbing supply business he'd built over 40 years in Ottawa, and he had told me, sitting at his kitchen table with his big weathered hands wrapped around a mug of red rose tea, that I was his favorite. That he worried about me. That he was going to make sure I landed somewhere soft. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in December, 14 months before Marcus put that sticky note on my keyboard. My brother's name is Daniel. He is 38 years old, and he had been managing our grandfather's business for the last 6 years of our grandfather's life. Which meant that when the funeral was over and the paperwork began, Daniel was the one sitting at the table with the lawyer and our grandmother and our aunt, and I was the one driving 4 hours back to Sudbury with Noah asleep in his car seat. Daniel called me 3 days after the funeral. He said the estate was complicated. He said there were debts I didn't know about. He said the business had been struggling and that Grandpa had taken out loans against the building, and that by the time everything was settled, there wasn't going to be much left. He sounded calm and reasonable and genuinely sorry, the way Daniel always sounded when he was delivering news that benefited him. I believed him because I had no reason not to. That was my mistake. Not trusting my brother, I've thought about that, and I don't think I can blame myself for trusting my own family. The mistake was not asking questions. Not saying, "Can I see the documents? Can I speak to the lawyer myself?" Not pushing back when something in my gut said the timeline didn't quite add up. I didn't push back because I was exhausted. Because Noah had an ear infection that month, and I'd already missed 2 shifts, and I couldn't afford to miss any more. Because grief does something to your ability to fight for things. Especially when the person doing the taking is someone you grew up with. Someone who used to split his Halloween candy with you on the living room floor while your parents watched the news. So I said okay. And I drove home, and I kept doing my double shifts. That was 14 months of my life. I called the number on the sticky note on my lunch break, sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage with the engine running because it was February, and Sudbury in February is not a place where you sit in a car with the engine off. Gerald Fitzpatrick answered on the second ring. He had one of those voices that sounds like it belongs in a courthouse, low and measured, the kind of voice that doesn't waste words. He said he had been trying to reach me for some time. He said he had a matter of some importance to discuss regarding my grandfather's estate. He asked if I could come to Ottawa. I told him I didn't understand. I told him the estate had been settled. I told him my brother had explained everything. There was a pause on the line that I would think about for a long time afterward. "Miss Beaumont Okafor," Gerald Fitzpatrick said carefully. "Your grandfather retained me to draft a will in September of 2 years ago. That will has never been presented to the court. The will that was probated last spring was drafted 18 months before the one I have in my possession. I believe you may want to see what your grandfather's final wishes actually were." I sat in my car for a long time after that call ended. The engine was still running. Outside, the snow was coming down in that flat, determined way it does in northern Ontario in February, like it has nowhere else to be, and all the time in the world. I thought about Noah that morning, pouring cereal at the kitchen counter, chattering about his science fair project, still wearing his dinosaur socks because he hadn't found his school ones yet. I thought about how I'd kissed the top of his head and how he smelled like sleep and apple shampoo. I thought about how I wanted things to be easier for him than they'd been so far. How I'd been wanting that for 8 years and somehow the easier part kept not arriving. Then I called my hospital supervisor and told her I needed 3 days of emergency personal leave. I drove to Ottawa the following Friday with Noah in the back seat, his tablet on his lap, his dinosaur backpack stuffed with snacks and library books. We stayed with my friend Priya, who had a house in Nepean and a guest room she'd told me was mine whenever I needed it. Priya knew things weren't easy for me. She was the kind of friend who didn't make you explain yourself. Gerald Fitzpatrick's office was on Spark Street, on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like wood polish and old paper. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He shook my hand and looked at me the way people look at you when they've been carrying something on your behalf and are relieved to finally put it down. He opened a folder on his desk. My grandfather had been very specific, he told me. The September will, the more recent one, the one Gerald had drafted, left the business building and its associated accounts to me, not to be managed on my behalf, not to be held in trust by Daniel, not to be divided between the family. To me, outright. There was also a personal savings account I had never heard of, separate from the business, containing just over $94,000 that my grandfather had been quietly setting aside for years. My grandfather had told Gerald why he was making the change. He had told him he was worried about Daniel, that Daniel had a habit of making decisions that suited Daniel, that he loved his grandson but he did not entirely trust him with something that was meant for Claire, and those were apparently his exact words. Something that was meant for Claire. I sat across from Gerald Fitzpatrick and I did not cry. I pressed my hands flat on my thighs and I breathed slowly, and I listened to every word. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since February in the parking garage. What happened to this will? Gerald Fitzpatrick folded his hands on the desk. Your grandfather's primary lawyer, the firm your family had used for decades, contacted me after the death. They said the family had located a more recent will and that my document was therefore superseded. They sent me a copy. The document they sent bore your grandfather's signature and was dated 3 weeks after the will I drafted. He paused. Miss Beaumont Okafor, I have been practicing law for 34 years. I knew your grandfather personally. We had lunch twice a year for a decade. The signature on the document they sent me was not his. I am not a handwriting expert, but I am also not a fool. The room was very quiet. Why didn't you come forward sooner? I asked. I did try to reach you, he said quietly, through channels I had available to me. But I want to be honest with you, I hesitated. I was uncertain. I had no hard proof, only my instinct. What I had was a document and a doubt, and a dead man's word against a living family member's. He looked at me steadily. But your grandfather asked me, before he died, to look out for you specifically, he said. And I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know it. He said you were the one who would need looking after, that the others would be fine, that you were the one he worried about. I drove back to Priya's house in a kind of silence that had its own texture, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of too many things at once. Noah was at the kitchen table when I got back, doing his homework with Priya's daughter, the two of them arguing companionably about whether sharks could live in the Ottawa River. He looked up when I came in. Mom, did you know the Ottawa River used to have way bigger fish than it does now? Like, historically? I didn't know that, I said. Priya's dad told us. He says humans ruined it. Noah considered this with the equanimity of an 8-year-old who has not yet had to personally reckon with what humans are capable of. We're going to do our project on it. I sat down next to him and helped him spell historically and tried to keep my hands from shaking. That night, after Noah was asleep on the pullout in Priya's guest room, I sat at Priya's kitchen table and told her everything. She is a very good listener. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she poured us both another cup of tea and said, What do you need? I told her I needed to understand what had actually happened. What had actually happened, as I pieced it together over the following weeks with the help of Gerald Fitzpatrick and a civil litigation lawyer he recommended named Amara Singh, was this. My grandfather had changed his will in September, quietly, without telling Daniel. He had done this because, in the last years of his life, he had been watching how Daniel managed the business, and he had not liked what he saw. Not dramatic fraud, not obvious theft, just a slow, consistent pattern of decisions that benefited Daniel and were explained away in ways that were technically plausible. Money moved between accounts in ways that were hard to trace. Expenses approved that couldn't quite be accounted for. My grandfather had started keeping notes. He had brought those notes to Gerald Fitzpatrick. He had changed his will. Then he had a heart attack. And Daniel found out about Gerald Fitzpatrick's existence probably through the primary law firm, Amara told me. Since lawyers sometimes communicate with each other on estate matters, and what happened next was what Amara called, in careful legal language, a document irregularity of considerable significance. The will that was probated was not the will my grandfather had last signed. The savings account had been folded into the estate and distributed before anyone thought to look for it carefully. The business building, the one my grandfather had meant for me, had been transferred into a numbered company that Daniel controlled. And I had been in Sudbury, doing double shifts and eating granola bars, and believing my brother when he told me there was nothing left. I want to tell you what it felt like to know this, because I think people sometimes assume that betrayal by a sibling must feel a particular way, volcanic, maybe, full of screaming and door slamming and confrontation. It didn't feel like that for me. It felt like standing in a room where all the furniture you thought was solid turned out to be made of paper. And you couldn't be angry at the furniture, because furniture doesn't choose what it's made of, but you could be angry at the person who built it that way and told you it was real. I was angry at my brother. I am still angry at my brother. I think I will be angry at my brother for a long time, and I have decided that is okay. But I didn't call him. Not yet. Amara Singh was meticulous and thorough, and she told me, handled cases of estate fraud before. She explained what we were dealing with. The forged signature on the later will was the cornerstone if we could establish that. Everything else unraveled. She had connections to a forensic document examiner in Toronto, a woman named Dr. Philippa Strand, who had testified in court proceedings before, and whose opinion carried weight. Dr. Strand examined the signature. Her conclusion was unambiguous. I remember the afternoon Amara called me with the report. I was at work, between patients, standing in the hallway near the supply room. She read me the key passage. Something about ink pressure and letter formation and the specific way my grandfather had always made the loop on the capital B in Beaumont that was absent in the contested document. Forgery doesn't happen by accident, Amara told me. This was deliberate, and it was careful, and someone knew exactly what they were doing. I thanked her. I went back to work. I took someone's blood pressure and checked someone's IV and answered a family member's question about discharge timing, and I did all of it with completely steady hands, because at a certain point, you learn to hold things in separate compartments, inside yourself, and that skill, which I had developed out of necessity, turned out to be useful in ways I hadn't anticipated. The process took 4 months. I won't detail every step of it because honestly, some of it was profoundly dull in the way that legal proceedings are dull forms and filings and depositions and counterfilings and phone calls with Amara where I took notes. In the margins of whatever paper was nearest. There were moments that were not dull. The moment Daniel's lawyer contacted Amara to say Daniel wished to discuss a settlement. The moment I had to sign my name to a sworn affidavit and I looked at my own signature and thought about how different it was from a lie. The moment the probate court issued its order vacating the earlier proceedings. There was one moment I want to tell you about specifically, because it matters. My grandmother, my grandfather's widow, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Paulette, who had lived in the same house in Gloucester for 39 years, called me on a Wednesday evening in April. I hadn't spoken to her much since the funeral. She and Daniel were close. Or I had thought they were close. I almost didn't answer. She said, I want you to know that I knew something was wrong. After he died, I could feel it. But I didn't know what to do with the feeling. I said, "You could have called me." She said, "I know. I'm sorry, Claire. I'm sorry I didn't call you." We were both quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather talked about you." At the end, he talked about you and Noah. He showed me a picture Noah drew for him, a house with a big tree in the yard. He kept it on his bedside table. I held the phone very tight. "He wanted you to be okay," she said. "He really did." I told her I knew. I told her I believed her. And I did. And I do. And that phone call was the first time I cried through any of it, not when Gerald Fitzpatrick told me about the will, not when Dr. Strand confirmed the forgery, not when Amara called with the court order. But sitting on the edge of my bed in my apartment in Sudbury at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, listening to my grandmother tell me about a drawing Noah had made when he was 4 years old that a dying man had kept on his bedside table, that was when it broke open. I let it break. Then I wiped my face and went to check on Noah, who was asleep with his mouth open and his dinosaur socks half off, because some things about that child have never changed and I hope they never do. The settlement gave me the business building, which had tenants and generated income. It gave me the savings account, with the accumulated interest. It gave me a formal acknowledgement, negotiated through lawyers and therefore bloodless and administrative, that the estate had not been handled correctly. Daniel did not go to prison. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know that's what people want, the satisfying conclusion, the handcuffs, the courtroom moment. What we had was civil litigation, not criminal prosecution. Amara explained the difference and the reasons and the likelihood of outcomes, and I made a decision based on what I could realistically achieve versus what would cost me more years and more energy than I had available. The civil settlement was real, and it was documented, and it is not nothing. Whether I will pursue the criminal route remains something I think about. What I can tell you is that Daniel no longer controls my grandfather's legacy, that the business, which my grandfather built with 40 years of his life, is now in the hands of someone he actually intended to have it. That Gerald Fitzpatrick sent me a note after the settlement that said only, "He would be pleased." I gave my notice at the hospital the following June. Not because I don't value nursing, I do, deeply. I always will, but because I could finally afford to breathe for a moment and think about what I actually wanted. I hired a manager for the building. I took a month off. I took Noah to the Maritimes for 2 weeks, and we drove the Cabot Trail and ate fish and chips in parking lots, and Noah collected rocks at every beach we stopped at, until the back seat of my car was essentially a geology exhibit. He asked me once, sitting on a beach in Cape Breton, watching the sun hit the water, "Mom, are things different now?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Some things are different," I said. "Some things are better. Are we going to stay in Sudbury?" "I don't know yet." He thought about this. He put a rock in his pocket. He said, "I like Priya's house. It has a good yard." I told him I'd keep that in mind. We moved to Ottawa the following autumn. I enrolled Noah in a school 3 blocks from Priya's neighborhood. I kept the business running. I started taking 1 evening course a week, something I hadn't done since before Noah was born, just because I wanted to and because wanting things is something I am slowly learning to take seriously again. My grandmother and I speak on the phone now, every few weeks. It is not uncomplicated. Grief and betrayal and family are never uncomplicated, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either very lucky or not paying attention. But she is nearly 80 years old, and she loved my grandfather and she loved me, in her way, even when she didn't know how to show it through the noise of everything else. I have decided that is worth something. I hold it carefully. I do not speak to my brother. He has not tried to contact me directly. I do not know what he thinks about any of this, and I have discovered, to my own mild surprise, that I don't need to know. What he did was a choice. What I do going forward is also a choice. Those two things don't have to be connected. Noah is 9 now. He is in the middle of a phase where he wants to understand how everything works, how the heating system in our building works, how contracts work, how courts work when my grandfather left something to one person and someone else took it. I try to explain things honestly. in age-appropriate terms. I tell him that sometimes people make choices out of fear or greed that hurt the people around them. I tell him that the best thing you can do when that happens is document everything. Find people who know more than you do, and be stubborn in a careful, methodical way. He asked me what methodical meant. I told him it meant doing things step by step without giving up. He said, "Like when you looked for your building?" I said yes. Exactly like that. What I want to leave you with, not as a moral lesson, because life isn't a fable, but as something I actually believe from having lived through it, is this. The people who betray you are counting on your exhaustion. They are counting on you being too tired and too grief-stricken and too busy keeping everything else from falling apart to ask the questions that need asking. And they are often right. For a while. They were right about me. For 14 months. That's 14 months I won't get back, and I try not to think about that too much, because thinking about it productively is one thing, and punishing yourself with it is another. But exhaustion is not permanent. Grief lifts, eventually. The questions that didn't get asked in the first year will still be there in the second year, waiting. Ask them. Find the Gerald Fitzpatricks in your life, the people who are holding something on your behalf, who knew the person who loved you and know what they actually intended. They exist more often than you think. Reach out to them. Answer the phone calls. Drive to Ottawa in February if you have to. Your children are watching how you handle it. Not just whether you win or lose, but whether you stay standing. Whether you do the next right thing even when you're tired. Whether you model what it looks like to be wronged and to still choose dignity over destruction. Noah keeps the rock he found in Cape Breton on his desk at school. He told his teacher it was from the best trip he ever took. He doesn't know the full story yet, or he knows pieces of it, the pieces I've given him, but someday he will know all of it, and I want him to know that his mother did not lie down and accept it. That she found a lawyer, and drove 4 hours, and signed the affidavits, and was stubborn in a careful, methodical way. That's what I've got for him. That, and the building my grandfather meant for me, and a yard with a good tree in it, because Noah asked for that specifically when we were finding our new place, and this time I could actually say yes.